What's up, gamers? I'm Josh, and this is Copper Dragon Games. Today we're looking at my simple system to use GIMP to create maps for Foundry Virtual Tabletop, or a virtual tabletop of your choice. It should work for all of them. I'll show you where to find map assets from one of my favorite artists. We'll talk a little bit about why you may want to use the Roll20 Marketplace even if you're not actually using Roll20. And then I'll show you my system for putting it all into GIMP and then putting it into Foundry Virtual Tabletop for use in your game. Let's get started. In Foundry Virtual Tabletop, the tile controls are really cool. I use them all the time, especially for different things that my players can interact with during the game. However, they're not the best for building maps within the Foundry system itself. The two things that I've run into that are annoying about building maps with tiles is, one, the occasional time when a player will have a loading issue with the different images in a map, and part of the map shows up while other parts don't. What you see here is a secret room that I created just on the side of a map for players to discover at some point, and they did discover it. However, as they opened it and saw into the next room, I had one player sounding really confused, and when I checked in, he shared that he could see the base map, but the tiles had not loaded for him. So on his screen, it looked like all the players were just standing on a blank canvas, which is what would be there if those tiles weren't there. Now that doesn't happen often, and even in that instance, I had 5 players running at the same time and only one of them experienced that little glitch, so it was probably a lag in internet on their end. The page just didn't load correctly. It did for everybody else, so it wasn't a major issue, but I'd like to avoid having that happen again. The other issue I've run into, which isn't a major deal, but it is for me, kind of a visual learner, visual processor. In the scene directory, the little preview that it generates is only from the base background image. It doesn't pick up any of the tiles that you add to the board. So in this case, I'm not going to click on it, but this map that I created called Valdella's Home, it started with just a blank grass background, and then I decorated the scene with different trees and a cottage and so on and so forth. But when I see the little preview here, it's just that grass background, and there's very little to differentiate it from other plain grass backgrounds, such as Tillich's Lake just above it, which I created in a similar way, but I used a map that already had some trees on it. In any case, again, not a major deal, but one that helps me stay organized because it helps me to have that visual cue of what's in that map. So I have stopped using the tiles tool to build maps within the Foundry system. I have instead started using GIMP. And I'm not a graphic artist by any stretch of the imagination, but I have a simple little trick that I've been using to build maps within GIMP that doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't take a lot of know-how as far as using the software itself. For today's demonstration, I'm actually going to be using a tile set that I purchased from an artist named Gabriel Pickard. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. If not, Gabriel, I apologize. But either way, I'll show you how to find his artwork so you can purchase it and download it. I will also show you how to use those assets to create a quick and easy map within GIMP. First things first, you're going to need some map assets. You can find these free online, but I have found that the quality of Gabriel Pickard's artwork is just amazing, and I have a hard time using anybody else for maps. I'm a little biased. I do use a lot of heroic maps though. So let me back that up. I will say most of my maps come from either Gabriel Pickard or from heroic maps. But anyway, for today's demonstration, we're going to be using Gabriel's. So I've already purchased this. I've owned this for quite some time, and I've used it in Roll20. I don't use Roll20 anymore. I have switched entirely over to Foundry Virtual Tabletop. However, I do still make artwork purchases on Roll20. And here's why. If I ever go back to using Roll20, those art assets will be within Roll20 and will not cost me storage space within the program. That's one reason. And two, it is really easy to download most of them with this little download button that is on the page. Now, some artists are designating their artwork as only usable within Roll20. To those artists, I say, sorry, you're losing my business because I'm not using Roll20, but I am using that marketplace. And if you don't let me download them, I won't be purchasing your stuff. But for those artists that allow the download, I'm still purchasing on this platform because if I ever go back to the Roll20 platform, I want to be able to use those art assets without taking up my storage limits. So anyway, first things first, we're going to download this. And we're going to download it to this is my delete me later folder. Then I actually need to unzip it. All that good stuff. And then we move over to GIMP. Now this is the typical GIMP setup. This is, I believe, the most recent version of the software. The first thing we're going to do is make a new file. We're going to make it pretty big. For this purpose, I'm going to start with 4800 by 4800. I don't know what the exact size should be. I think 4800 by 4800 is a pretty good size for this particular way of creating maps. But we go ahead and generate the image. Doesn't really matter what the background is because once you put walls into your map, your players probably won't see the background anyway. Once you've created your map, there are two things you have to make sure you do for this process to work well. The first is that you have to make sure your grid is on. There are a couple of places to find the grid, but the easiest way I've found to find it is just to go to Edit and Preferences, and as soon as it pops up, there we go. There's a little grid here. Now what you want to do for this is make sure that your grid is set for 140 pixels. This will make sure that as you're adding the different art assets, that they come in at the correct size and that they fit together well so that when you link different pieces together, there aren't any seams in the artwork, there aren't any weird breaks between the different tiles. The color doesn't matter that much. In fact, with this it matters very little because in a moment we are going to set our map to snap to the grid. So once your grid is set, you want to go to View and click Show Grid first so we can see it, and then Snap to Grid. Now this becomes very, very helpful as we start adding assets from Gabriel Pickard's set of artwork. Those different pieces of the map just snap together, go together seamlessly so that your players can't tell after the fact that it was cobbled together from lots of disparate pieces. The next thing we do is we start adding those pieces from the maps. So then we're going to open as layers, and you can select one or more of these different items. Now, part of the reason that I said 4800 by 4800 is because a lot of Gabriel Pickard's maps, at least the big ones, come in 30 by 30, and his maps are sized so that 140 pixels are one square on the map. So if I open one of these, then it takes up most of the map, but it gives me a little bit of extra on the ends, so that if I want to close up one of these passages and not have it lead off, I can add, well actually I'll show you. So if I want to close up this passage and make it not run off to another map, so to speak, tunnel end, let's find a tunnel end, a small one. Well, actually, we'll use the other one instead. This side. So, when you open a new layer, all your layers are over here on the side. You can just move it to where you want it. And you can zoom in and see it lines up with the map so that your players won't be able to see. This is totally seamless. Let me turn off the grid for a second. Oh, that is not seamless. So we're going to pause for a quick voiceover here. This was recorded after the fact because while I was recording the actual video, at this point I started getting incredibly frustrated because the process I'd used for creating maps in the past was just not working. The tiles were not lining up together to be seamless as I was trying to describe, and it was just a mess, and I was super frustrated. After a few minutes of troubleshooting, I realized that when I opened this big tile as a new layer, it centered it on the image rather than snapping it to the grid. And moving it even a couple pixels would have snapped it to the grid as I intended all along, and then this little tile on the side would have lined up perfectly. Unfortunately, it took me a few minutes to realize that, so I bumbled along for a little while, and then finally fixed the error and got back to the video. Okay, so I just realized I can't get them actually on the map entirely unless I move this over just a little bit, which makes me think I might need to up my overall image size. I haven't really run into this issue before, but now if I want to select this and line it up, you can see it automatically snaps there. I don't have to do anything special. You get it close enough and it snaps in place, and the artwork lines up perfectly so that once you take the grid off, players will not be able to see that there is a difference here. It snaps together seamlessly with very little effort on your part, and you can slap together these maps really quickly. Now clearly, I cheated a little bit on this one by starting with a huge map rather than making my own, but I'll show you just how quickly you can throw one together. I'm going to go ahead and delete this big map. I'll start here with a blank slate and time myself and share how long it takes me to throw together a really quick but nice looking watery cave complex. So let's get started. Okay, so that was 10 minutes exactly, and this map, I wouldn't say I'm proud of it. Given a little more time, I could do much better, but for 10 minutes of time investment beyond setting up the map with the grid and downloading the image assets is pretty awesome as far as creating a map that looks this good, and the detail is amazing. Even, as you zoom in, players are going to see an amazing amount of detail here. This may not be a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, but it's quick and easy and perfectly suited for a quick one-shot or just an encounter area that you need to have ready for a side quest or a time when players go totally off the rails and you need to occupy their time for the rest of the session so that you can drop back and punt, so to speak. And prepare for whatever direction they went into that you were not expecting. I do want to take note of a few things that I noticed as I was throwing this together in 10 minutes that are probably not as obvious if you've never used GIMP before, that can make things a lot easier for you if you're attempting this. One of them is that this dragging moving tool is going to be your best friend in this. There are tons of other things you can do in GIMP, but for this, all you're doing is dragging layers around. However, you want to make sure you have pick a layer or guide selected here, because if you have moved the active layer, then nothing I do, no matter where I'm clicking, it's always going to move that one thing rather than what I'm clicking on, because I've got it selected over here and this is the active layer. If you have this one clicked, then in order to move something new, you have to click on it over here and then move back and move it, blah, blah, blah. As long as you have pick a layer or guide, it doesn't matter what's selected, what you click on is what's going to move. That's probably not the most obvious function of a program like this, especially for newbies, but it is something that will save you some time. Another good thing to note is that when you do click on them, it does highlight them on the right side of the page. So as you click these, whichever layer it is that you're selecting and moving will highlight over here. That is important for this next step, because as you start building your maps, mine was pretty quick and easy and small, but if you get into a really large, complicated map with lots of different layers, once you put together an area that you know is going to go together and you're satisfied with the layout, you can actually merge it and combine those layers so that they move together. So say I wanted this one and this one. I could move these down so that one was on top of the other. You can right click and click merge down, and it'll combine those two layers. Now this little rectangle that popped up, this is a pretty common thing. This is just the fact that this tile does not have a transparent background, and you can fix that in one of two ways. The easiest way to fix that is to just find that tile and the one that it's overlapping, and make sure that the one that it's overlapping is above the other, and it takes care of that really easily. There are a couple of cases where you may run into having a bunch of tiles next to one another so that you can't make that happen, and in those cases you can select the tile that is on top, the one that's overlapping everything else. Take the little fuzzy select tool, drag your threshold down to 0, and just click in that black section around it. It'll automatically select everything that is black in that area. Then you want to right click it, go down to colors, and of course I don't have it set to alpha, so I didn't have an alpha channel added. So what I need to do is keep that selection, go over to layer, go to transparency, and then add alpha channel. That will allow you to do this next step, which is to right click, go down to colors, and color to alpha. And what this is going to allow you to do is choose a color that within that section you have selected, which in our case is just black, and make that color transparent. So the color we want to make transparent is black, and you can see the preview already coming up here. Now we have made the black part and the edge of this section transparent. And now everywhere we move this, the edges are going to be transparent. So if that issue ever comes up again with this piece, you won't have to worry about it. Gabriel also has some of his sets. I want to say it's most common in his construction save sets, which are primarily for caves, where he already has that border transparency built in. But there are plenty of his sets that do not. So knowing how to do that it can be pretty helpful in this process. So once you're finished with everything, you're just going to File, Export. And you do want to make sure that this is in your Foundry VTT data folder. And as you can see, when I started, I was downloading a bunch of Roll20 assets, and I have since joined the Heroic Maps Patreon, and I have lots of things in this folder that are not actually from Roll20. But whatever. In hindsight, I probably would have organized this very differently, but it's a little late for that. But we're just going to put it in the Roll20 assets folder. Go ahead and export. Then we can switch back over to Foundry, and we can create a new scene, and we'll call it Swamp Caves. And it's going to resize this automatically, so I'm not real worried about it. But Untitled is what we called it. I should have named it something different, but I didn't, so here we are. Lots of different things that you can set here, but I'm not going to fool with that now because I'm just showing you the map. Okay, so now we have the swamp caves over here on the side, and you can see that it picked up all the tiles. If I had built this with just tiles within the program, those would not be there. It would just be a black background. we can view that scene. And it is a rather large map, just like I like them. Oh, the one thing that I did forget to change. Whenever you create one of these maps and you do it with Gabriel's art assets, you do need to change the grid size to 140 pixels to match the size of the map that you created. And everything is set up so that each of these is 2 squares wide. So for games like 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, that would be a 10-foot wide passage. Now this artwork is going to be high enough resolution that if you wanted to make things a different size, if you wanted to make your grid a different size, you could do that very easily. Say I wanted these to be ginormous caverns. I could easily switch this to 70. Whoops, not 700. Oof. But 70. And make these much wider passages. 20 feet wide instead of 10. They might look a little odd with this particular set of artwork with giant lily pads. Those lily pads look like they're about 2 feet wide or 2 feet in diameter. I don't know if real lily pads get that big, but it seems a little off to me. So this particular map is probably not good for that, but Gabriel's maps are high enough resolution that in most cases, as long as the details make sense to scale up, it's very easy to scale them up to double the normal size or double the suggested size, and they still look really good on your virtual tabletop. And at this point, you would go ahead and add your walls to the map and populate
That's all we got for today.
Some dungeon
I hope you enjoyed this video and found it
and
useful.
have yourself
if you like
a
what you saw,
great
learned something new,
D&D
or just enjoyed
session.
hanging out, please click the like
So
and
with that, we're gonna
subscribe
wrap it
buttons
up.
below. Those are the
And
best ways to support the
let's move
channel
to the
and give
outro.
me some traction as I grow my YouTube following. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time when I bring you more tips and tricks to make sure your Dungeons & Dragons games are as great as they can be. See you then.